Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Larry Lederman, and on behalf of the Center for International Governance Innovation, CIGI, welcome to this Global Policy Forum in Ottawa. First, I would like to recognize some of our guests. The Ambassador of Macedonia, His Excellency Tony Dymowski. The Ambassador of Bolivia, His Excellency Pablo Guzman. The Ambassador of Poland, His Excellency Andrzej Konieczny, and members of the embassies of Mexico, Costa Rica, Egypt, Jamaica, the United States of America, Philippines, and Indonesia. I am also pleased to welcome the Vice President of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, Colin Robertson, and members of the Canadian government, including Global Affairs, Public Safety, NRCan, Environment and Climate Change Canada, Justice Canada, Finance Canada, the Bank of Canada, IDRC, and students and faculty of the University of Ottawa, Carleton University, and U of T, and the United Nations Association in Canada, and members of the media. And it is now my pleasure to ask the Managing Director and General Counsel of CIGI, Aaron Schull, to introduce our distinguished speaker. Aaron?
Good evening and welcome to CIGI's Global Policy Forum. Since 2012, the Global Policy Forum has offered a platform for leading experts to bring their insights directly to key stakeholders and contributors to Canadian policymaking. Thank you again for joining us this evening to make this forum a success. After 7 decades, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or the GATT, and now the WTO have provided predictable, rules-based framework that has helped underpin Canada's economic growth and prosperity. But there's some uncertainty in Geneva, as some countries are now increasingly pursuing their trade objectives outside of the WTO framework, namely through bilateral or plurilateral agreements. The angst over the WTO's future was evident earlier this month when Canada and other WTO members issued a joint statement expressing concern about, quote, increased trade tensions and the risks of the risks for the multilateral trading system. Together, they called for action to address major challenges facing the WTO, including the inability to conclude trade negotiations and bridge divergent positions on trade and development. Disenchantment with the international trading system is growing outside of Geneva as well. There are some pockets of people who say that economic globalization has upended so many traditional livelihoods and industries. Others see the WTO system as unresponsive to both national and international action on problems like climate change and gender inequality. These dim views held by some are helping to fuel a growing protectionist sentiment we now see in many parts of the globe. As a long proponent and beneficiary of the WTO and the rules-based trade it represents, how is Canada navigating this new reality? Fortunately, we are joined tonight by the one person who is perhaps best placed to tell us. Since August 2017, Stephen de Boer has been Canada's ambassador and permanent representative to the WTO in Geneva. His mandate includes not only helping to reinvigorate the organization's regular program of work, but also ensuring that the government's priority trade issues, gender, micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, and e-commerce also make it on to the WTO agenda. Ambassador de Boer is no stranger to the contentious world of multilateral negotiations. His past roles include serving as Canada's lead counsel and then deputy chief negotiator on international climate change negotiations. As former director of the Softwood Lumber Division at Global Affairs Canada, Ambassador de Boer knows full well the unique challenges of dealing with the U.S. on trade matters. He holds an LLM from Georgetown University, and prior to his posting in Geneva served as Canada's ambassador to Poland and Belarus. In short, he brings to tonight's forum not just the experience of his 9 months at the WTO, but a perspective informed by decades of professional and academic work in trade, international law, and multilateral diplomacy. Please join me in giving a warm welcome for this evening's Global Policy Forum speaker, Stephen de Boer, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Canada to the WTO.
Thank you very much, Larry, and thank you very much, Aaron, for that introduction. I'm going to start off by apologizing. I didn't know I had allergies to springtime until I had my first spring in Geneva. I got over that, and then I came here and going through it all over again. So I feel a little bit congested and maybe not speaking as clearly as I would like, so please bear with me. But I very much welcome the opportunity this evening to speak to you about advancing Canada's interests at the WTO. As part of that, today I would like to share some reflections on the ministerial conference that was held in Buenos Aires in December of last year, known as MC11, and what its legacy could be in terms of the future of the WTO, and also as a vehicle to advance Canada's interests at the WTO. I would also like to describe the Government of Canada's priorities at the WTO as part of Canada's progressive trade agenda, and how we plan to advance so-called new issues, such as e-commerce and trade and gender. I also need to recognize and address the well-known challenges facing the WTO. As you know, the WTO is a cornerstone of Canada's trade policy. The Government of Canada has a diversification agenda ensuring that jobs, growth, and prosperity generated by the global trading system are sustainable, inclusive, and widely shared. As repeated by Minister Champagne, we must also ensure that trade is a march to the top and not a race to the bottom. It also bears repeating that trade is essential to the Canadian economy, a relatively small market, and thus we need to penetrate new markets in order to continue to grow our economy and support good-paying jobs. In all of this, a stable, predictable, and rules-based global trading system is critical for Canada's economy and quality of life. A number of important bilateral or regional free trade agreements, NAFTA, CETA, and now CPTPP, all of these headline-stealing deals certainly advance these goals, but it's worth remembering that these agreements are predicated on the existence and core principles of the World Trade Organization. The WTO is the foundation upon which these more comprehensive and deeper trade agreements are built. So Canada depends on the WTO, and our most important trading partners do as well. But it's impossible to ignore the fact that the WTO is facing significant challenges across a range of fronts, including in delivering new negotiating results, the dispute settlement system, and the day-to-day monitoring function of the organization. I will share my views on these challenges and how we advance our interests at the WTO, but first, a brief summary of what happened at MC11 in Buenos Aires. As you are probably aware, WTO members did not deliver any new concrete negotiating outcomes at MC11, but I believe that MC11 should be considered a modest success considering the circumstances. Anyone who was following the debate in Geneva prior to MC11 would know that progress on the long-standing negotiating issues was going to be difficult. Aside from positive results at recent ministerial conferences, such as the Trade Facilitation Agreement at MC9 in Bali and on agriculture export subsidies at MC10 in Nairobi, WTO members have essentially been deadlocked on the broader Doha development agenda for a long, long time. I may slip into DDA. If I do, that's the Doha Development Agenda. In fact, at MC10 in Nairobi, ministers essentially agreed to disagree on whether to continue with the Doha mandate. Since then, the situation has become even more difficult, with the United States under the Trump administration favoring bilateral trade discussions rather than engagement in a multilateral setting such as the WTO. As WTO Director General Roberto Azevedo said prior to and following MC11, not every ministerial conference is going to deliver significant new outcomes of the same magnitude of prior ministerial conferences. Some ministerial conferences need to be more about housekeeping or charting the way forward. So with this rather bleak backdrop, what did happen at MC11? Ministers engaged intensively in trying to make progress in a number of the traditional areas of WTO negotiations, including on agriculture, special and differential treatment for developing countries, fisheries subsidies, domestic regulation and services, and on a proposal on transparency and regulatory measures concerning trade in goods. While we deepened discussions and gained a better understanding of positions, it was simply not possible for all 164 members to agree to any concrete outcomes in these areas. But we did make some progress in important areas considered to be new, entre guillemets, in quotation marks, issues for the WTO. MC11 featured a number of initiatives advanced by large groups or coalitions of members aimed at making international trade more inclusive. These initiatives included discussions on the integration of micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, or MSMEs, into international trade, on trade and gender, and on investment facilitation. A considerable amount of time was also drawn to the importance of continuing work on e-commerce to ensure the WTO is relevant to the way that the world trades today. Canada's delegation was led by the Minister of International Trade, François-Philippe Champagne, and we actively engaged in many facets of the discussion. We focused on traditional areas of interest for Canada, namely agriculture and fishery subsidies, but also on the so-called new issues of e-commerce, MSMEs, and gender as part of Canada's progressive trade agenda. Finally, many ministers recognized or acknowledged that the WTO is not perfect and that it's essential to strengthen the commitment to improving the system. Several ministers agreed that we need to create a space for high-level policy dialogue on the challenges, possible solutions, and on new directions. MC11 could therefore be a positive turning point for the WTO, given that many members, including Canada, are clearly interested in discussing new topics and in improving how the WTO functions. As the chair of MC11, Susana Macora of Argentina, said in her closing remarks, there is life after Buenos Aires. MC11's legacy will not be about Doha or no Doha, but about what members want to do next. Moving forward, Canada is prepared to engage in discussions and make progress. There is some excitement around the prospects for discussions on the so-called new issues, namely gender, MSMEs, e-commerce, across a large and diverse group of members. These issues are likely to be advanced plurilaterally, meaning we're not going to include all of the members, between delegations that express support for these ideas at MC11. But all WTO members are welcome to join, and the ultimate goal is a multilateral outcome, one that all will agree to. I would like to share Canada's views on these three areas, which all align with Canada's progressive trade agenda. In this way, the WTO is clearly advancing our trade interests. First, on gender. As you know, Prime Minister Trudeau is committed to advancing gender equality and women's empowerment both in Canada and through our international engagement. This is rooted in Canadian values of diversity, inclusiveness, and equality. Women's economic empowerment is a key priority of Canada's progressive trade agenda. This means working to ensure that all segments of society can take advantage of and otherwise benefit from the opportunities that flow from trade and investment. We do not yet have enough data on how trade agreements affect men and women differently, but what we do have suggests that action is warranted. For example, studies of SMEs by the International Trade Center have found that women-owned SMEs, or small and medium-sized enterprises, are less likely to trade and are more likely to report burdensome procedural obstacles than is the case for men-owned SMEs. Meanwhile, in some countries, legal gender differences make it difficult for women to own property, open bank accounts, start businesses, or enter certain professions. Research by the World Bank, the IMF, and others have shown that these legal gender differences significantly decrease female labor force participation and undermine GDP growth. A 2015 study by McKinsey Global Institute found that advancing women's equality could add $150 billion to Canada's annual GDP growth and add $12 trillion to the global gross domestic product by 2025. As Prime Minister Trudeau and Minister Champagne have said on numerous occasions, not only is promoting gender equality the right thing to do, it makes good economic sense. So how do we go about promoting gender equality in trade policy? The recently updated Canada-Chile FTA includes a new chapter on trade and gender. The chapter acknowledges the importance of incorporating a gender perspective into economic and trade issues. The chapter represents a first for Canada and for any G7 country. This is a good first step for Canada, but we do not intend to stop here. Canada will continue to seek gender provisions in future FTAs to ensure that women and women-owned SMEs, for example, can benefit from the opportunities that flow from trade and investment. We are also looking for areas outside of the trade and gender chapter to include progressive gender-related provisions. For example, at the WTO, we are pursuing a proposal to ensure that domestic regulatory regimes do not discriminate against women in the licensing and qualification of service providers. By being willing to ask the question of what can trade agreements do to advance the empowerment of women and girls, we are discovering that there are indeed opportunities to do so. To this end, in the lead up to and during MC11, Canada championed the Buenos Aires Ministerial Declaration on Trade and Women's Economic Empowerment. The declaration is similar to the FTA chapter that I described earlier. It affirms the importance of advancing women's empowerment in economic policy and sets out collaboration to be undertaken between the participating WTO members. The declaration does not prescribe any particular approach or rules, but asks the question, what can we do at the WTO to advance women's economic empowerment? Trade rules may be gender neutral, but through the declaration we will ensure that they are not gender blind. We will develop a shared knowledge base in a series of areas, and we think that the declaration is one of the great successes of MC11. So far, 120 members of 164 have joined the declaration. These members span every continent and all levels of development, which shows that the issue resonates with everyone. We expect that more will indeed join in the months ahead. Canada and other proponents will hold a series of seminars through 2018 and take stock of our work in 2019. Canada is already leading on plans on a seminar sharing our domestic experience with gender-based analysis. MC11 also featured discussions on how the WTO could help micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, or MSMEs, integrate into international trade. A group of 88 WTO members, including Canada, agreed to launch an informal work program at the WTO to address this question. MSMEs are already an important element of the WTO's work. Everything we do has the potential to help MSMEs. The very existence of the WTO at the center of the multilateral trading system helps MSMEs. A rules-based, predictable, and stable trading system helps level the playing field for small players without vast resources that large corporations may have. But it's not enough. Small businesses are the backbone of Canada's economy and most economies around the world. But the trade data illustrates that they do not trade as much as larger companies. The work program will allow members to discuss policies or measures that will help MSMEs trade across a range of areas such as trade facilitation, access to trade financing, access to information on trade requirements, and predictable regulatory environments. At this stage, the initiative is not about creating new rules. It's about holding an open conversation. But some of the ideas may lead to new negotiations on rules or help advance ongoing negotiations. Canada will be active on this front, and we hope to draw from our own domestic experiences. Thirdly, electronic commerce, which sadly is still considered a new issue for the WTO. I say sadly because obviously e-commerce has been around for a very long time. Digital technology has become a fact of life in trade. There's hardly an international transaction that takes place without some form of digital communication. This means that the existing WTO framework already covers electronic commerce extensively. E-commerce is embedded in trade facilitation, services commitments under the General Agreement on Trade and Services, or GATS, and the Information Technology Agreement, and so on. So what more can be done at the WTO? Canada desires space in the WTO negotiating agenda for the consideration of new rules that would help us leverage e-commerce for inclusive economic growth. We believe that electronic commerce presents new opportunities to connect rural to urban economies, facilitate the participation of women in the formal economy, and provide micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises access to a global consumer base and reduced overhead costs through cloud-based solutions. We want to use the WTO's rule-based system to help create the conditions to achieve those benefits. At a minimum, the WTO should be able to put in place standards of good practice which will facilitate the use of e-commerce. In addition, establishing common rules in areas such as electronic signatures would be a win-win outcome and would bring the WTO framework into the 21st century. To this end, Canada joined a group of 63 members in launching plurilateral exploratory work on prospective negotiations. We plan to follow this issue closely and be an active player in the discussion, and we have been up until this point. All of these new initiatives are consistent with Canada's progressive trade agenda, and as such, the WTO has become an important vehicle to advance the progressive trade agenda. It has also underscored one of our goals to make the WTO relevant and to address the challenges of the 21st century. While Canada sees several opportunities for more meaningful discussions at the WTO, we also recognize that the WTO is clearly facing serious challenges. This is of great concern, given the importance of the WTO to Canada's trade agenda and the fact that the WTO is the cornerstone of the international trading system. In particular, the organization obviously struggles to deliver new, concrete negotiating results. While there have been some wins in recent years, for example, the Trade Facilitation Agreement, disciplines on agriculture export subsidies, decisions benefiting least developed countries, and an expansion of the plurilateral Information Technology Agreement, WTO members have failed to deliver on the expectations of the Doha Development Agenda. This single undertaking concept has proved to be too difficult. Beginning at MC10 and continuing through MC11, WTO members have acknowledged that we need to do things differently. A key challenge on the long-standing issues will be finding the political will necessary to make the difficult decisions needed to deliver meaningful outcomes. This challenge does not become any easier to overcome when a major member, such as the United States, is not as engaged in the multilateral sphere as they have been in the past. But I was very encouraged by the United States Trade Representative Lighthizer statement at the conclusion of MC11. The statement essentially communicated a clear willingness to discuss issues such as fisheries subsidies and e-commerce with members who want to be part of the discussion. And he reiterated these views during a recent meeting of the WTO members of the margins of the WEF in Davos. This is a positive sign, and Canada looks forward to working with the United States in WTO negotiations where there is scope to do so. Speaking of the United States, there is clearly some frustration within the current U.S. administration with the WTO's dispute settlement system, which is another area facing serious challenges. Due to these frustrations, the U.S. is holding up the appointment of new members to replace vacancies on the appellate body. Canada is disappointed that the United States is blocking the selection processes. Canada is willing to work on the U.S. concerns. We need to find a way to resolving this stalemate. In the meantime, we believe that the appellate body should be permitted to continue its work. However, even setting aside the appellate body issue, the dispute settlement system is under significant pressure. The increasing number of large, complex legal issues coming to the WTO is putting strain on the system's resources, and timelines are getting longer and longer. One could argue that the increasing number of cases is a clear vote of confidence in the system, but others would say that members are looking for solutions to problems in the dispute settlement body that cannot be resolved through negotiations, so using litigation to get a result that they've been unsuccessful to do in the negotiating process. Given the importance of the dispute settlement system to the WTO and, in particular, to Canada, we see a real need to begin a discussion on how to improve the system in addition to resolving the appellate body appointment process. Perhaps the impasse on the appointment process is an opportunity to examine whether the dispute settlement system is adequately resourced and if there are ways the system can be streamlined. While the challenges facing the negotiating and dispute settlement functions are most often discussed, many members, including Canada, see a real need to improve the functioning of some of the WTO's regular business, such as improving performance and compliance with existing commitments. As part of this discussion, Canada supports examining how work in the WTO's regular bodies and committees could be reinvigorated or made more effective. This is only natural 25 years after the Marrakesh Agreement. We should review what it is that we are doing and ask the question if there are processes that could be improved, enhanced, or dropped. Doing things because we've done them a certain way for over 20 years is not a useful way to conduct our business. After more than 20 years, it's natural that members assess how it could be improved. We should not see such an exercise as a threat to the system. Similarly, the WTO's transparency elements have allowed us to learn a lot about the trade policies of our partners, but we believe that the membership could do a better job in this area, and we look forward to playing a key role in discussions on improving the transparency system at the WTO. So with these challenges in mind, Canada's priority moving forward will be to preserve the integrity of the WTO and multilateral rule-based trading system for the benefit of Canadian businesses and workers. We also look forward to advancing work under Canada's progressive trade agenda in the areas of trade and gender, MSMEs, and e-commerce, while finding new solutions to long-standing issues, such as in the area of agricultural trade. Thank you very much.
Ambassador de Boer is open to questions. I would ask you to use that microphone in the center aisle, identify yourself, and ask your question. So we have a lot of trade specialists here. Who'll be first? Okay.
Ambassador, thank you very much for those words. That brings me up to date. I am particularly interested now in national security provisions that are embedded in certain countries' trade laws, and how the United States is now taking some advantage of such provisions in their trade law to really stymie the dispute settlement mechanism. And I'm worried that it applies now to aluminum and steel and potentially to cars. What is the discussion ongoing at the WTO that will give some better definition and some limitations in respect to how countries invoke these provisions, national security provisions?
Well, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of debate in Geneva about the national security provisions. It's Article 21 of the GATT, and it has traditionally been seen as a bit of a nuclear option, quite frankly, that it was there but not meant to be invoked. And it is now being invoked by the United States, but the United States is not the first to invoke this. It's actually being invoked in the context of a dispute between the Gulf states with respect to sanctions against Qatar by other Gulf states. So there's a number of debates embedded within that, and that is whether national security is self-defining or whether there are rules by which, interpretation rules as to how Article 21 is to be interpreted. And I think it's too early at this point to know where that discussion will end up. because it's not clear. First of all, the case involving the Gulf states is rather preliminary, and this what we call the Section 232 actions taken by the United States on steel and aluminum is very preliminary. The EU certainly takes the view that this is not an appropriate use of the national security exemption, and this is rather a safeguard action, and they are responding to this as if it was a safeguard action. But we will have to see. We will have to see how this unfolds within the WTO context. But there is a great deal of debate with respect to the use of this provision, absolutely.
Yes, George Jacobi, retired diplomat. I wanted to ask you how the WTO might deal or is dealing with another mainly American transgression, the extraterritorial application of law indirectly or directly to force actions on the international trading and investment activities of foreign firms outside the jurisdiction, and Canada has had much experience with that. I remember working on the investment desk back in the 80s when the Americans were trying to stop that pipeline being built in Europe and imposing sort of direct legal strictures on their companies, and it was brought up in the OECD, which went on to try and establish a consultative mechanism called conflicting requirements on multinational enterprises. This was at the same time the US was taking us to that investment forum at the OECD over the National Energy Program. So there is a mechanism to at least force consultations on that. And then, of course, we had experience. I happened to be posted in Iran and Libya when the D'Amato Act imposed extraterritorial controls on all foreign companies trying to do business in Iran or Iraq by taking away chances to do business in the United States. And that went on for a number of years. But now with the breakup over the Iran nuclear agreement, we have a situation where the Europeans who want to maintain the agreement are insisting on proceeding with trade and investment with Iran, and the US has, as part of their sort of demands on Iran and their demands for renegotiation of this agreement, are set to impose sanctions that would restrict the activities of Canadian and European firms. The European firms, the EU is already reacting. And so I'm asking you what the WTO is doing about this and what it could do about this in the context of a consultation.
Traditionally, the WTO has had very little to say on this particular question. The investment provisions in the WTO are limited to those measures that are related to trade, and so it's not as fully fleshed out as other areas of international commerce. So responses have been, as you point out, more in the context of the OECD, or responses have been domestically. So in Canada's context, through the Special Import Measures Act, for example, or the EU has had mirroring provisions to what the US has done. And I have to tell you that that particular discussion with respect to Iran is not a discussion that we are having in Geneva. It seems like, and I don't know this, but it seems like it's something that's more restricted to capitals. It would be more of a Brussels, Washington discussion, not one that we're having in Geneva.
My name is John Sinclair. I used to have a background in international development, working in CEDAR and in the World Bank, but I wanted to talk about the future rather than the past, in a sense. You presented in your opening comments a story that I also feel very sympathetic to, that we have a whole series of new actors at play in the world around international trade, and they really are not in a mood to work together. There's been a lot of history, at least as I would understand it, inside the World Trade Organization of organized conflict, organized competition between different groups, the South and the North and so on. But after, I don't know how many years it now is, you probably have a better sense of time after, maybe it's even as much as a decade, but it's certainly 5 or 6 years of all these tensions. I'm just wondering whether we should now be talking about a different tack, whether not we in this room, but people like yourself and your colleagues. I mean, do we want to start to look for a new model? I mean, and I'm just going to throw an aspect of a new model on the table and ask you it as a question, because we see different groups coming together, different clusters of countries coming together and saying, we will get on and deal with our issues. I mean, maybe that's what Canada is doing as well. We're joining groups in different parts and coming together. But do we want to, in a sense, start thinking about a world where you don't have a WTO, but you have a whole series of clusters of actors who come together and put together their own mini WTOs, their own mini organizations? Is it too late to try and put Humpty together again, which is what I sometimes sense we're talking about on the WTO? Are we actually having to look for a whole different new path? And in a sense, because trade is so important to the future of the world, and as somebody who deals with international development, trade is essential to the future of developing countries, the poorest countries of this world. And those opportunities have been squandered as we talk about these rescue efforts on some of the aspects of WTO. So is it time for a new beginning?
It's not exactly where I thought that question was going to go, but let me say this, because I think there are opportunities to think about new beginnings, but I would not suggest that a very useful new beginning would be the demise of the WTO. There are some fundamental principles embedded in the WTO that we believe, Canada and a lot of other countries believe, are fundamental to the organization of the International Trading Order, one of them being most favored nation treatment, another one being national treatment. That needs to be applied across the board. But when we think about new approaches, there's a couple of things, and this is not a Canadian position. We haven't come down on any of these things, but it certainly strikes me, and we've certainly been talking about this in Geneva, that perhaps one way to press reset on the way we think about trade and trade negotiations would be to look at them through the prism of the Sustainable Development Goals. Maybe that's one way to think about agriculture negotiations, for example, rather than the rather binary way that we view them now. It's an idea. It's not Canada's position at this point, but it's something that people are talking about. The other thing that's missing right now is in the lead up, we were used to this in the Kennedy round and the Tokyo round and the Uruguay round, which resulted in the WTO. We had a comprehensive trade negotiation. The advantage of a comprehensive trade negotiation is that you can make trade-offs. And you can trade off something in agriculture because you're going to get something in services, for example, or something in non-agricultural goods. If you start slicing things up into discrete compartments and you only talk about agriculture, for example, and it's not linked to market access for non-agricultural goods, then it's more difficult for countries to make those trade-offs. And so right now we seem to be quite afraid to do something that's comprehensive, but maybe doing something comprehensive is the only way where we can create that environment where we will be willing to make the trade-offs that are required. The other thing that I find quite exciting about what's happening post-Buenos Aires, or what happened in Buenos Aires, these plurilateral processes are, first of all, they're not unique to the WTO system. We've done it in the past. The Tokyo round itself was a plurilateral agreement. This is somewhat different, and this is more trade liberalizing in that at the outset, members have said this is going to be transparent, it's open to everyone to participate, and if we negotiate any results, they will be applied to all members on an MFN basis. So you don't have to sign on to this to actually get the benefits of whatever it is that we would negotiate. We don't know what that will look like yet, but it actually is embedded in the notion itself is this idea that it would apply across the membership. So if all 63 members negotiate something on market access with respect to electronic commerce, we've already committed that it would apply to everyone. So we have this notion in international trade of what we call the free rider problem, where countries take advantage of tariff concessions, for example, without giving anything in return because of the most favored nation principle. And we're basically acknowledging you can free ride. And because we recognize that free riding actually, and that is liberalizing and good for the system. And so you will hear criticism of the plurilateral negotiations that have been launched, but there are elements of those plurilateral negotiations that are quite, I think, exciting from a trade liberalization perspective. So there are a number of notions within the WTO construct itself that I think might be helpful in trying to turn the channel and get some progress.
Hi, Ambassador. So I'm Mena Nathu from Center for Trade Policy and Law, Carleton University. My background is international trade law. I was the first and only foreign advisor to the Russian delegation for the WTO accession to their accession. And currently, I'm working with Africa, with the African continent, to support trade services on helping or supporting them to implement the CFTA. So that's my background. What I would like to ask you is, I am doing a commentary with the Canadian Foreign Policy Journal. And so it's timely that you're here, because what I'd like to ask you is, I'm actually doing it on the progressive trade agenda. Right, and so what's happening? Like, what do you think I should say? Because what is new? No, I'm being very honest. I'm like, I'm talking to the editors, and I'm like, what is new, and what should I say? Like, and of course, not from an academic perspective, but just, is there anything new to say?
Well, yes, there is. CG, I'm going to give a shout out to CG, who did a series of 18 commentaries that we presented, or CG presented with our assistants at the WTO, looking at various aspects of trade and gender, women's economic empowerment. Canada hosted a day-long seminar at the WTO on women's economic empowerment. What's stunning is, when you ask what's new, what's stunning is how little we know. And so we're walking around blind, but we do know enough, as I said in my remarks, we do know enough to know that by looking at this issue more closely, we think we can unleash a great deal of economic activity. And so, for example, the International Trade Center will tell you that 1 in 5 women-owned SMEs exports. It becomes 2 in 5 if they have access to an e-commerce platform. And so that knowledge, without that knowledge, I don't think countries would be as excited to engage in the plurilateral e-commerce discussion. We are, because we think, okay, we've signed on to the Buenos Aires Declaration on Women's Economic Empowerment, and we're involved in the e-commerce discussions because we know it's a good unto itself, and we also know it will empower women, and we also know that women are engaged in MSMEs. A large number of MSMEs are owned by women. So we need to talk about shared experiences with respect to MSMEs and see how that discussion can be used to lever and unleash that economic power. And then it becomes a virtuous, I would say, circle, because now UNCTAD is looking at financial inclusion and saying, well, what are the barriers for women engaged in trade, to actually get the financing that they're required? So what I am fairly new to this particular topic, and I'm stunned and amazed how little we know. And so I really feel like at this point this is baby steps, but very exciting when we think about the economic spin-offs that we will unleash. So for me, that's the new part. Just asking the question, starting to do the research. Another really great example is when economists will model what trade liberalization means. They'll take a basket of goods and say, okay, well, the tariff cuts will mean X, Y, and Z for this economy, and this is how Canada or economy in Mauritania will benefit or be hurt by the trade agreement. They don't think about who's actually buying the goods that are going into that basket. And we know that women consumers buy different things than male consumers. And what we sometimes think male consumers are buying are actually they're buying because a woman is telling them to buy them, and vice versa. So we don't actually know what it means. We've got a bunch of male economists saying this is what I would buy and modeling it. It's not really an accurate portrayal of what's happening in the economy. It's 2018 and we're now saying, oh gee, maybe we should. Like, there is a tariff line for socks, and there's a tariff line for women's socks. Like, what does that mean? Who thought that was a good idea? It seems completely illogical. It's either socks, or you would differentiate between women's socks. I don't know what that means. It's a very odd thing to do, and somebody should start asking these questions. That's what I think is new about the progressive trade agenda. That's what's new about what's happening at the WTO. Read the 18 commentaries. You can riff off of them.
Thank you, Ambassador. Phil Rourke, also from the Center for Trade Policy and Law. You were saying that plurilateral may be the way to go, at least as an interim measure. Which plurilateral negotiations do you think have the greatest promise? Why? And what do you think would be a likely outcome of those negotiations between now and the next ministerial?
I would say at this point, the most likely would be on e-commerce, mostly because of the energy I sense in the room, and also because the United States is part of those discussions. They're not negotiations yet, they are discussions. What would make that story more complete would be if China was also part of those discussions, but I will tell you that China is in the room, and they're following and they're participating. I don't know if, I have no idea whether MC12 is an appropriate marker, but Canada has just tabled a proposal in these discussions, and it's about market access. And there we propose a number of changes to GATT schedules for electronic commerce. And so a liberalizing of members' GATT schedules. GATT's schedules, sorry, that's my allergy, and also making permanent a moratorium on the tarification, as it were, of electronic commerce. So there are some concrete proposals that have already been made by Canada. There are a number of members that are pushing to wrap up these discussions and start negotiations as soon as possible. As soon as possible in WTO parlance is a little hard to gauge. But I would say that from our perspective, that probably has the most promise. But if you talk to China, for example, I would suspect they would say perhaps investment facilitation, another plurilateral within which Canada's engaged. They might argue that that has the most potential. But yeah, there is an energy around these. I should also say that there is skepticism amongst some other members about these plurilaterals. So I don't want to appear Pollyannish about them, but I think there is energy around them, particularly around e-commerce.
Thanks, Ambassador. Great talk.
Tony, could you use the mic? I don't think they could hear you. Excuse me.
Tony Bruns, former finance official, mainly involved in the private sector. Great talk, Ambassador. A lot of fun. E-commerce. Tell me, what is the thinking with respect to government taxation and how to deal with, so to fill the government's coffers from revenue lost from domestic suppliers, and secondly, how to make things equal, for instance, in Canada in the telecommunications field for our incumbents that we all love versus a Netflix in terms of taxation policy?
So the moratorium is a little hard to get your head around. We're not talking about a moratorium on a GST type tax. So we already tax services. We tax Netflix as a service. The moratorium itself is actually fairly theoretical. It presupposes that finance departments would find a way to actually tax the thing that's being produced and bought and sold. And if members could figure out how to put a tariff on that, we think that would be harmful to e-commerce. Quite frankly, when I talk to Finance Canada officials, they say we can't imagine a world where that would be possible. But in case it is, let's go for a moratorium. So it's actually quite theoretical, and it's different absolutely than a services tax on the service that's being provided. So it's the tax itself that we're talking about, or the moratorium, is the thing that's actually being transmitted, not the value of the thing that's being transmitted. It's almost impossible to get your head around it, and so the moratorium, in a way, is a bit of a freebie because we haven't figured out how to do it. But perhaps we will in some, 20 years from now. And so if we can start with the premise that it's tariff-free, that would be useful, particularly when you remember that the WTO was meant to be trade liberalizing. So it's an unusual concept to get your head around, quite frankly. Finance Canada is still bemused by this. So they agree.
Well, the Europeans seem to
They too support the moratorium, though. Yeah. Yeah.
One last question.
Oh, I'm off the hook.
You're shy. You've covered everything.
Oh.
Okay, one last question.
Oh, this will be the killer.
Hope not. Gavin Charles with the Canadian Council for International Cooperation. Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador, for your remarks. My question relates to the position of the progressive trade agenda within an integrated Global Affairs Canada. And I'm wondering if you can speak to how progressive trade is aligned or not, as the case may be, with the feminist international assistance policy, with broader foreign policy agendas, and what prospect you see for integrating that approach within a multilateral context like the WTO. Thanks.
So I think the last part of your question is relatively clear in that we definitely see, as I said earlier, we definitely see links between the progressive trade agenda, women's economic empowerment, and e-commerce, and, for example, MSMEs. That's the easy part, I think. And so that's the trade side of Global Affairs Canada. The bigger challenge, but not an insurmountable challenge, it's a discussion within the department And that is with respect to the Feminist International Development Agenda. And there, we started off with the premise, and this is something that came from the previous government, and we've carried it on. It started off with women and girls and maternal health. And the progressive trade agenda, I would argue, is a natural progression in that discussion. Once you've talked about health and you've talked about access to education, the progressive trade agenda is the next piece, which is to say women's empowerment has got to be economic empowerment. It's not, women's health, of course, and maternal health is critical, but long-term impact and long-term benefits to women has to be linked to economic empowerment. Women have to become independent economic actors in order for this to work. And so I don't think there's anything incoherent about the progressive trade agenda and the feminist international development agenda. I see that as a natural progression. Where I sit in the WTO, I don't actually think deep thoughts about the international development agenda as much as I do about what does progressive trade mean in the context of the WTO. But I see them as being absolutely linked. And so there's no contradiction. One flows into the other, in my view. Well, I think it's a view shared by my government, quite frankly.
Thank you. It's now my pleasure to ask Aaron Schul to thank our speaker.
Well, this is always a privilege and an honor for me to do, to thank our speaker after such a dynamic and interesting talk. And I always learn when I come to these global policy forums. And for example, tonight I learned that there was a different tariff line for men's and women's socks. And I'm struck by that because I'm going to have to tell my wife about that, because from time to time she's been known to steal socks from my drawer, and I'll need to tell her that import law would now prevent that from happening. So thank you for that. No, all joking aside, I'm struck by four observations from your remarks. The first is that trade is different. Trade is different now than it was 20 years ago. When you think back, it was about wood and chickens and corn, and now we're talking about empowering women and girls through a progressive trade agenda. Now we're talking about a data-driven economy and how we tax intangible goods or how we regulate the transfer of those goods across borders. Trade is also complicated. That's my second observation. And it's complicated by geopolitical factors on the one hand and domestic politics on the other hand. And I would say that there's a dynamic interplay between those two things. The third observation that I had is that the trading system is under strain, and one only needs to turn on the news to see that in real time. And the fourth and final observation, and perhaps the most important one, is that Canada is ably represented by an incredibly talented pool of people. The ambassador is the vanguard of that. So, ladies and gentlemen, please, I would ask you to join me in thanking our speaker, Ambassador Stephen de Boer. Thank you very much.